name is David Pyle, and welcome to the Board Basics webinar, Part 1. This is the first time we have done this as a webinar. We have been doing this Board Basics class for the last 3 years in different parts of the region. We've tried to travel around and make it available to different parts every year, but we realized that this is something, congregational boards have new board members every year, and people who are coming into governance level congregational leadership every year. And so welcome to our experiment of being able to do this training, this workshop, over 3 sessions. We'll talk about those in a minute. Beth, and everybody is now coming in right on time because we are Unitarian Universalists.
And I actually have an email from someone who can't get in. So.
Right, and we come to church and meetings right at time. So we'll give it a few more minutes while we let some people come in. I make the commitment in all of the workshops and trainings that I do that I start on time and I end on time. And this is scheduled to be a 90-minute workshop, so we will be ending by 9 p.m. Not just because of my commitment, but also because I still have to make dinner tonight. So there's a motivation known as my spouse that will have me finish this workshop on time. Beth is going to talk in a minute about some of the technical details. But first, I thought we would do, while people gathered, a quick introduction of myself and my roles, and Beth will ask to do the same. Beth Casebolt, my co-facilitator. Could you go to the next slide, Beth? So for those that can't see me on the screen, we will be sending these slide decks out, so don't worry about that. My name is David Pyle. Formally, I am the Reverend David Pyle. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister who has served congregations in Illinois, in Michigan, and in Southern California. I have served, it's now been a total of 5 years on district or regional staff with 2 different districts. I started off with the Central Midwest District of the UUA, and most recently was the district executive for the Joseph Priestley District of the UUA. Now, as a member of the regional staff, my roles are primarily, I am the primary contact for the congregations of the Delmarva Peninsula, of Central Pennsylvania, and of Greater Baltimore. And I serve on the regional staff as the governance program manager, so boards and bylaws and committees, as a member of the large church support team, as the Arts of Ministry program manager, which is worship and pastoral care and music and committees on ministry, and as one of our staffing specialists, and I run our adjunct consultant program. And occasionally, often as rarely as possible, I help congregations with recovery from professional staff misconduct. So that's kind of my roles on our regional staff. Besides being a member of your regional staff, I am also a U.S. Army Reserve chaplain, and so based out of Fort Dix, New Jersey. And some people know me for that. So as you're coming on, I'm encouraging you to be able to mute you can mute at the bottom left-hand corner of most screens, or by tapping the screen and an icon will come up. So as people are still coming on, welcome everyone. Beth, would you like to do an introduction of your roles on our regional staff and in supporting our congregations?
Sure. So my name is Beth Casebolt. I've served a small congregation as a DRE for 8 years, and then moved on to district leadership. I served on the board and then became the district administrator of the Ohio Meadville district, and then shifted into the position I'm currently in, which is operations manager and communications consultant for the Central East region. I serve as the primary contact for the Appalachian cluster congregations in West Virginia and Western Maryland, one in Ohio. And I basically oversee all of our administrative staff, and I manage social media, website, all of that sorts of thing. That's my specialty area. And then provide support for a lot of different things. I play in the insurance stuff, I play in the youth stuff and safety. I obviously have an RE background, so I work in that as well. So that's me.
So Thank you, Beth, and I'm very grateful to Beth being willing to do this webinar series for me. The webinar series of this was actually her idea, so I want to give kudos. This is happening because Beth Casebolt had the idea to make it happen. So, Beth is going to be managing some of the technical side of our work tonight, because we know that when I get started on my topic, I kind of get lost in it. So, Beth is going to be managing the chat box and looking for questions and things there. There are some sessions where we're gonna pass back and forth. So expect that. But because it is such a large group, we're gonna ask everyone to mute if you can, either mute on your phone or mute through the system. That allows you to then, during the presentation, ask questions through the chat box, or if you are on the phone only, we're going to invite you, and you don't have a way to see the chat box. In that case, we would invite you to unmute at an appropriate moment and ask your question. If not, save your questions till the end. We have a question time at the end, and that is fine. Often when I do teaching like this, when I do classes like this, what I ask of people is that questions during the presentation, during the didactic, to try and focus it on understanding, on clarifying, on being able to make sure you grasp that you're getting what it is we're talking about, and that we save the after question for some of the more deeper processing and some of the places where maybe there's an experience you have that doesn't resonate correctly with something we've said. And so I invite you to maybe even have a pad of paper out so you can write those down so you don't lose them, because that's kind of what we hope to do in our session at the end. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Yep. So what I wanted to do first was to walk us through what the outlines are going to be for all 3 sessions. Now, we won't necessarily do this in every session, but I wanted to do it at the beginning so you have an awareness of what we're doing today, what we're going to do at the next session, which is, I think, Beth, do you remember the date?
The 7th. It's in 2 weeks on the 7th.
Yeah, it's in 2 weeks on the 7th. And then the session after that, I think, is the 21st.
Yes.
It's 2 weeks later.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. So
Yes.
all 3 sessions, and so we're going to walk through those real fast, and then we'll move into the actual presentation after a few technical administrative details. So this session is focused on the question of what it means to serve on a congregational board. So this is the more heavy theory section. The next 2 sessions are going to be more practical application. But this one is more about what it means to serve on a congregational board. It's going to focus on the question of why congregational boards are different from other kinds of boards, like corporate boards and academic boards and nonprofit boards. What's the operational and strategic board continuum? Because not all of our congregational boards are the same. One of the beautiful things about Unitarian Universalism is that we do not have a book of order. There is no one right way to organize a Unitarian Universalist congregation for decision making. And unlike some governance consultants, I don't believe there should be. I think that there is great blessing in the diversity that we have in the ways we organize ourselves as our congregations. We'll talk about the types of governing boards, the relationship between the governing board and the executive, however the executive is formed, and we will engage what that means. The relationship between a governing board and the minister for congregations that do have ministers. How relationships and roles change with board service, how your relationship and your role in the congregation shifts as you join serving the governing board. What is role clarity and how to achieve it? And I'm going to do a short introduction of the 5 strategic tasks of a board. And that piece is kind of an ad for a traveling workshop that I do called How to Be a Strategic Board. That is an in-person day-long workshop, but we're going to introduce those 5 strategic tasks as a core way to kind of understand what is the roles of a governing board. What are the things governing boards are trying to do to accomplish? We'll do a quick briefing on governance documents, and we're going to close today with some conversation and presentation on the board as a good employer. Because our congregations often struggle to be good employers of staff, and that's just part of the complication of being the challenging nature of how our congregations are organized. So we're going to name all those, and that's our agenda for today. So it's a pretty full agenda, right? So you're going to hang with me. I will we'll talk about some of the ways that that we're going to make this easier for you in a minute. The next session is going to be on September 7th, and it is technical and adaptive skills for board service is the theme for that one. So we're going to talk about the difference between the adaptive challenges versus technical problems, a way to kind of understand the different types of problems that congregations work with and be able to know how to respond. We'll talk about the balcony versus the dance floor, which is a wonderful metaphor for the board's role of looking at the whole of the congregation and not just the particular pieces you're most engaged with at a particular moment. We'll talk about leadership differentiation and how you as a leader are able to see what parts of how congregations interact with you are about the system more than being about you, and the ways in which you can see that and feel that in your leadership role within the congregation. We'll talk about confidentiality and transparency, and that is one of the larger problems that many of our congregations face, and we'll explore the difference between confidentiality and secrecy, among other things. And because boards have roles boards have sometimes where they have to hold some confidentiality, and we'll talk about that dynamic. We'll engage in a wonderful distillation of a wonderful book from titled Healthy Disclosure that some of you may have read. Distillation of that text into a 4-part process that boards use to make difficult communications decisions. To be able to walk through a process when you've got something and you don't know how to share it with the congregation, here's an easy 4-part process to help you walk through figuring out how and what to share. And with whom. We'll talk about linkage, or how boards are connected to their stakeholders, to their congregation members and other stakeholders in the community. We'll talk about one of the more difficult conversations we have with congregations, and that is the idea of board covenant and speaking with one voice. How boards stay unified in their public communications and their private communications. Voting and consensus process and the balance between those two. We'll spend some time on that. We'll talk about how to run effective meetings. They make fun of me because I used to have a copy of Robert's Rules of Order framed on a little pedestal behind me. We'll bring in some Robert's Rules and some more stuff for how to run effective meetings. And then we'll talk about healthy conflict for boards. How boards can be in disagreement in love and in trust in ways that are generative for the future of the congregation. So that's session 2 in 2 weeks. Session 3 on September 21st is really the practical one. It's the workshop where, if you see, we're going from really theoretical to really practical in a spectrum. So in this one, we're going to talk about just some real basic tools, like how to read a congregational budget and profit and loss statement, which frankly, I didn't know how to do when I first served on a congregational board. We're going to talk about that. And it's not helped by the fact that every single one of our congregations has done it differently. Right? So we'll probably, and we're getting some feedback. So if you could mute, come on. I think it's Eric JC Otts.
I know who that is.
Yep, that is giving us some feedback. So if you could mute at the bottom left-hand corner. Thank you. So there we go. So we'll talk about some other styles, such as what process observation can be the powerful tool of that within a board. How many, you don't have to say, but we'll talk about how to use a consent agenda and how powerful a tool a consent agenda can be to free up board time. We'll talk about the technique of board meeting versus board workshop. Don't worry about that. We got plenty of time with it. We'll even maybe practice a powerful question or two. We'll talk about the different ways that you communicate with the congregation in person, like cottage meetings and town halls, and how you assess your own board culture. What are some of the different board roles and positions? Because amazingly, in Unitarian Universalism, not all of our boards are designed the same. Our boards are designed differently, right? And we'll talk about the difference between open and executive sessions and how you use both appropriately. that is the Board Basics course of what we're going to engage for these 3 sessions. So I'm glad you're here. If we to the next slide, we have just a few reminders for this workshop. The first one is, because we have such a large group, I'm going to invite you, for those of you that are on the computer, to be able to write questions you have where you're seeking to clarify something that I'm sharing, to write that into the chat box. And Beth will read those out as you write them, and I will incorporate them into the presentation. We've designed this slide deck to be both graphic and notes, so that there'll be graphics on the screen, but there are also my notes embedded in the slide deck, and we're going to send this slide deck out to all of you at the end of this workshop, at the end of this session. So for those of you that are obsessive note takers like I am, I'm not saying don't take notes, because you can still do that. What I'm saying is that everything that is on the screen you're going to receive. When sharing stories or questions, I've added this because it's happened. So I'm just going to name this at the beginning. When you're sharing stories or questions, remember your commitments to confidentiality, that this is not confidential space. We are actually recording this event, and it is going to be made available on the web. Our hope is that boards will be able to use this webinar series in the future as some of your own board training. We'll probably do it again in live webinars like this, but just know that this is not a confidential space, and that both Beth and I are available outside of this webinar. Even if I'm not your primary contact, I am a member of your regional staff and your governance program manager. I always encourage you to go to your primary contact first, if you at all can. I hope all of you know who your regional staff primary contact is. If you don't, we will find a way, let us know that, and we'll make sure you find out who your regional staff primary contact is. The point being is that we hope that if there is a confidential issue or something that you need to ask a question about or share, we're going to invite you to do that offline. That way, no one is put into a position where something is shared here that would be inappropriate. So with that, as people are still joining us, I want to thank you all for coming, and we're going to now get started with some of our presentation. And I always begin my presentations by trying to name some of my assumptions, by trying to name some of the underlying foundations behind what I'm sharing, so that you can judge it. I do not believe, I trained initially as a historian. We have someone who just came on. Their name is welcome on the screen. If you could mute, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. I don't believe, I trained initially as a historian, I don't believe that there is any unbiased person. The best that we can do is to share our biases, to share our assumptions, and let people judge what we share through that lens. And so I wanted to share, one of the things that I'll be doing is I will have a graphic up on the screen for part of why I'm talking, and then at some point Beth will advance it so that you all can see the text. The text is both there. So the first assumption that I bring to governance work and to this workshop, this webinar, is that the purpose of church is not governance. The purpose of church is the congregation's mission. It's your vision. It's the transformation you wish to create in people's lives and in the community you serve and in the world. And that governance is good when it is serving the mission. That there is no one standard behind what that looks like, other than that it is helping your congregation to live your values, your goals, your ideals, and to be the congregation you want to be, and that the world needs you to be. That's the first assumption. The second assumption I bring is that culture is stronger than structure. That we can make structural changes to a congregation all day long. We can design new committees and restructure the board, and none of that will matter if the culture doesn't change. And so a lot of the work that I bring is looking at how do we adapt congregational culture under the belief that I think that if the culture changes, the structure follows that. And that that you can actually make real changes in congregational structure if the culture changes. The most effective way I've found, and this is the third assumption, the most effective way I have found to make changes in a congregational system is for individuals to change their own functioning. That the best way that congregational systems adapt is by a group of people choosing to change how they act in the system. For anyone who has studied anything about family systems theory, you know, one of the lessons that they teach is that the only person you can change in your family is you. And then other people adapt to the changes you make in yourself. I think the same thing is true with leadership in congregations. The only thing leaders can change is themselves. And then the system adapts based upon the changes that leaders make. So a lot of this workshop is based in helping you understand your own functioning and have good tools for your own functioning so that you can choose how you want to function in the congregational system. One of the big assumptions that I bring, and it's one of the things that I think marks me out from some other governance consultants, is I really do not believe that there is a single right way for a congregational governing board to function. I think that all of our, one of the beautiful things about Unitarian Universalism is that we're really 1,000+ differently designed congregational systems. And the congregation's culture and its history and who has been in leadership and how they were influenced all influences that. One of the blessings of that is that it means I permanently have work as a governance consultant in our system because every congregation is independently designed. And it means that some of the deeper work for questions around, people ask me all the time for best practices, and I say best practices for who? Because we have ideas and we can try them in your system, but what worked at one congregational system may not work so well in yours. And so what I really want people to hear from this is that I am really agnostic when it comes to how a congregation is designed or how it functions, so long as it is serving mission. So long as it is helping you. And I'm going to mute. There we go. As long as it is serving mission, as long as it is helping you live your values and beliefs in the world. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And that is that congregational boards are different. Now, when I do this in an in-person workshop, what I do is I ask people in the room to raise their hands if they've served on a different kind of board. If they've served on a nonprofit board or a corporate board or an academic board or on some kind of, other kind of board. And usually about half the room will raise their hands. That's part of who we are. I see Harriet has raised her hand. Harriet, did you have a question?
I think she was raising her hand that she's been on a different board.
Gotcha. Thank you for doing that. So there's a virtual way to do that. I didn't know that. Wow. We bring that experience of having served on a different kind of board. And what I first want to start with is by saying that congregational boards are different in kind. The congregational boards, I've served on nonprofit boards, I've served on some other forms of boards. The congregational boards really are different. And while there is some great lessons and experience we bring from those other board experiences, they don't often translate well into congregational board leadership. There is a different level of policy development that is, and we can go to the next slide. There's a different level of policy development that is needed in congregational boards. We're going to spend a whole section on that a little bit later today, There is a different form of linkage, a different form of connection. I often tell the story about a nonprofit board I served on, a hospice board, where the staff and the board only saw each other once a year at a fundraiser ball. And even at then, the staff had all gotten a memo of what they were allowed to talk to the board members about and what they were not allowed to talk to the board members about what the restrictions and structures of that relationship were, because of a firm line of division that is often maintained in many boards between the staff of an organization and even the clients of the organization and the governing board. In congregations, that does not happen. That in congregations, your board members are members of the congregation, and the members of the congregation are your friends and sometimes your spouse and your family. There is not any clear delineation of relationship between the governing board members and the members of the congregation. And we wouldn't want there to be. If the idea was that to be the governing board member, you couldn't come to church for the entirety of your service, that's a terrible idea. That's not something we would want to, we would ever want. So that is a difference. There's also a distinct challenge of congregational board role confusion that happens for congregational boards that doesn't exist in other kinds of boards. In a corporate board, you're probably, the main relationship that you have to that corporation is that you're a board member. But in a congregation, you're a board member and an RE teacher, and you participate on Sunday, and you come to the social justice events, and you've been an RE teacher for 20 years. And the OWL program is very important to you because your children went through that. So our roles are complicated and complex. I've met maybe 3 people who are serving on boards of Unitarian Universalist congregations who, when I ask the question, is being a board member your only role? They can say yes. And so there is much more role confusion in congregational boards than there are in other forms of boards. And there is also a different kind of relationship with the executive. Now, I have been for the last 3 years the executive of a nonprofit known as the Joseph Priestley District. And the relationship between me and my nonprofit board is very delineated. It's very structured. There is limits of what they can talk to me about. There is responsibilities I have for them. Even though I'm a minister, that one has functioned more like a more standard nonprofit. In a congregation, depending on how you define the executive, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, in a congregation, the executive could be you. There are cases where the board is the executive. The executive could be a team of lay leaders who you are also in close relationship with because you've been congregants, and frankly, some of them have probably been on the board at some point in the past. Or the executive is your minister, in which case the executive that you as a board are holding accountable is also your spiritual leader, mentor, and pastor. So there are just some profoundly complicated relationships that exist in congregational boards that don't exist in other kinds of boards. Congregational boards, I think, are also different in kind, that board members have a covenantal relationship as members of the congregation. Now, covenant is one of those words that ministers sometimes throw out there. Or somebody once told me they thought covenant meant the name of any agreement we make at church. But covenant is really the kind of relationship that you've invested some of your deepest self in, some of your identity, some of that which makes you you. Is the kind of relationship that it doesn't make you just angry if the covenant is broken. It hurts because you've really invested some of yourself into it. And I think people have that within their relationships in a congregation. I do a significant amount of congregational conflict mediation, and the reason why those congregational conflicts are hard and they can be so hurtful is because we've invited people to invest their deepest selves and their values in these communities that we form, in these congregations. And so there is a different level of relationship than you might have in a nonprofit board outside of a congregation or a corporate board or an academic board. In many cases, not all, but in many cases in our congregations, you have a minister who is an ex officio member of the board, and that is a member of the board by right of office, who may also be the executive. So you have the different case where in many other institutions, the executive is not a member of the board. But in the case of our congregations, the executive can be a member of the board, even if they're non-voting. Ex officio does not mean not really a board member. It means a board member by right of office. And in many ways, especially in the case of called ministers, they are the long-term, indefinite tenure board member. And the non-voting is often, in my opinion, there in order to protect the pastoral relationship, so that people do not end up on an opposite vote from the person who is their spiritual caregiver. There's also a higher level of responsibility, visibility, and accountability from congregational members, in that you can't get away from them except by not coming to church, and that's a terrible idea. So you are in regular communication with congregation members who 90% of the time aren't paying attention to what the board is doing. But the 10% of the time they are paying attention to it, they are really paying attention to it. And you are in direct one-on-one relationship with them every Sunday. You may be teaching RE classes with them. So you're in that a deep, closer, accountable relationship than most other boards are with their stakeholders. Board members are fully integrated, hopefully, in the life of the church, as are their families. And so you have the case where board members' families have sometimes been triangulated, have sometimes been brought into conflicted relationships because of the board member service. And lastly, board members often have multiple other leadership roles. I'm not going to talk about that when we have a whole section on it coming up.
David, we have a question in the chat box.
Yep.
Have you really not found a set of general best practices? Are there not general best practice principles that help?
So here's the reason why I say I don't believe in best practices. I believe that there are some ideas, there are some things that we have known to work, there are some points that we think congregations can try, and our congregations really are very different. And what works in one congregation may not work in another congregation. So if we say this is the best practice, but it works well in a late stage program model congregation, when we try to apply it to your, let's say, early stage pastoral model congregation, or even worse, your fellowship, it completely doesn't work. And so our promulgating it and saying this is a best practice is based upon a false premise. It's based upon a false premise that there is a standardization among our congregations. At the same time, I think that there are really great ways and tools and ideas that we can help train leaders in who know their congregations, who can then discern how those ideas and tools can best serve their congregation's mission and vision. So I think best practices implies a universality that doesn't work in our faith tradition, because we do not have a book of order. Does that make sense?
And we have one other comment. We don't have a person specifically called executive. What other titles might an executive have, and how is the executive role generally defined? And we're going to talk about that later.
Hold that, because we're moving into it. So I'm going to ask you to hold that question, because we're getting there. And
someone disagrees with your general practices statements.
That's fine. I am happy to have people disagree with me. That's one. As long as we disagree in love, we can do each other no injury. So with that, I wanted to go into moving into an idea that our congregational boards are not the same. That and this has a size component to it, but it's not completely bound by size. I have found all of these different styles of congregational boards in many different sizes of congregations, and it touches on history, it touches on culture, it touches on, and to the point I said before, I think the practices that work in these different congregations work differently based upon these board styles. And so the first thing I want you to think of is that I see these styles as being on a continuum, being on a spectrum. In the in-person workshop, I define these basic styles, and I have congregation members stand up in an isometric exercise and line up where they think their congregation is. So I'm going to invite you to imagine that as we talk about it. Think about where those styles are. And one end of this continuum is a completely operationally focused board. A board that spends 100% of its time on the operations and administration of the congregation, making sure that the lights stay on, the bills get paid, that the work is getting done, that staff are being supervised, that the programs are functioning. A board that spends 100% of its time on those kinds of administrative, operational, and programming details. The other end of the spectrum is a board that spends 100% of its time on strategic matters, on thinking about the congregation's mission vision, on the strategic planning, on bylaws and policy, and how to set the congregation's future, how to assess how well programs are doing. But all of those operational concerns are done somewhere else. They're not in the board's purview. Now, these two ends of the spectrum, I've probably named two congregations that I think were purely on one of those two ends. And I'm really agnostic about where you are, because different congregations in different sizes and cultures have different needs that address different ways of board functioning, right? There is a size component. You do generally find that the larger the congregation is, the more time the board makes for more strategic matters. And the smaller the congregation is, the more time the board makes for operational matters. And that's also not universally true. I have known some medium-sized to large congregation boards that were primarily operational. And I've known some smaller congregational boards that spent most of their time on strategic work. And as long as it's working for that congregation to live their mission and vision, then good governance is defined for me by if it's working, if it is serving your congregation's goals, and only you can be the judge of that. So I think of these boards as kind of in three subcategories. The first are the operational boards. And operational boards make all decisions that relate to program and money, that every decision comes to the board. Even if a committee has made a recommendation, it's the board that is the final deciding authority. And I would say this is probably at least a quarter of our congregations spend most of their time in the operational mindset. The next type is what I would call managing boards. And managing boards are ones that make all the decisions in areas that are outside of specific program areas where they have delegated it to someone else, where they have made a decision to delegate some decision making to someone else, but all other decision making they maintain in their portfolio. So this is where they may have delegated to, let's say, the minister, the decision about who is in the pulpit every Sunday. But all the decisions about funding and budget, the board is maintaining those decisions themselves. There are two structures that are more hybrid, that rest kind of in the middle of the spectrum. The first is what I would call a portfolio board, and many of our congregations have portfolio board in their history. A portfolio board is where the board members are made up of the committee chairs. That all the program committee chairs, the finance committee chair is the member of the board from finance. The worship committee chair is the member of the board from worship. So you have a centralization because all of the key stakeholders are at the board table, but they are also running programming. One of the challenges of this structure is that you basically have your board members doing double duty. The board members are also managing their own committees. The more common version of this that tries to address the same, and this is addressing a linkage problem. Its goal is to have all the key stakeholders at that table making those decisions together. The compromise that many boards have come to is what is called the liaison board. And liaison boards are where board members have specific liaison responsibilities to different areas of the congregational program and life. So you have the trustee from religious education, who is not the religious education committee chair and not the director of religious education, but is an official board liaison to that committee. Another common one would be that the treasurer is the official board liaison to the finance committee, to different organizations such as that. And so that every board member, either the officers and or the trustees at large, have this direct formal linkage in their role. And this is quite a few of our congregations that have this structure. And once again, it can work. If it's working for you, amen. The biggest challenge of these two structures for congregational boards is that they tend to be higher conflict boards, because board members are brought in to want to see decisions that the congregation is making through the lens of their specific responsibility to that area of the church programming. So the typical conversation I talk about is the board meeting talking about the budget, where the board members aren't looking at the health of the whole. Each of them is arguing for the protection of the resources and assets for the area of the congregation they're most connected to, that they're the liaison for. And once again, it can work. I think a good board covenant and some grace can help make that work, and also a little board training and functionality on being able to get to the balcony, to be able to see the wider congregational picture, while still representing and making sure that the interests of that particular area of the congregation are respected and honored and taken care of. The two types of boards that I finish with are at the more strategic end of that continuum. And the first one is what I call a strategic board. And a strategic board is one that, regardless of the structure, focuses the majority of their time, in some ways the overwhelming majority of their time, on the 5 key strategic tasks and not on congregational operations. We'll talk about the 5 strategic tasks in a few minutes, but they focus their time looking at what is the congregation's mission and vision and how that affects decision making. They focus time on fiduciary responsibility, on congregational assessment, on good policy making and generation, and on strategic planning, on planning for the future of the congregation. And that someone else in the system is focusing on the administration and operations of the congregation. And there's multiple structures for that. I will name them. But I will say that I offer a traveling in-person workshop that is about an 8-hour workshop titled How to Be a Strategic Board, that we're offering in the DC area this fall. We'll be offering it again somewhere else. We're thinking Ohio in the spring. My goal is to do it at least twice a year in a different part of the region. So just know that if being a strategic board sounds like a good idea to you, we bring a traveling workshop that we hope whole boards come to be able to talk about that transition. The last of the types of governing boards that are on the far end of the continuum spectrum is what's called a policy governance board. And policy governance is a phrase that has come to mean a lot of things. I think that there are actually about 4 different systems that get called policy governance that are, many of you may be familiar with Dan Hotchkiss's book, Governance and Ministry, or what one of my governance consultant friends calls policy governance light. I'm a big fan of Dan Hotchkiss's work and his system, but the core of policy governance is about trying to define the relationship between the governing board and the executive, whoever makes operational decisions, through policy in a way that has mutual accountability. At its core, it seeks to create a structure of accountability for the board to be able to have oversight over the congregation's operations, mission, and ministry and programming. While the operations, ministry, and programming has the access to the board to make sure that the resources are appropriately funded and that the oversight is there. It structures that relationship. In one version of policy governance known as Carver, the Carver model, does that through a series of negative limitations. It says what the executive is not allowed to do. The executive shall not do this, and they shall not do that. But anything that the board sets a series of ends, of goals, of things that the congregation is to try and achieve, and the executive can do anything in meeting those ends that are not limited. Hotchkiss is a more positive framing. It frames more what the executive should be doing, what the goals are, how you meet the goals, what's an appropriate way. But both of them seek to do the same thing, to create a structure of accountability. So I'm going to move us to the next slide. And this is the question that somebody asked a few minutes ago. What is the relationship with the executive? And I'm using the phrase executive because there isn't a single phrase to be able to grasp all the different ways our congregations manage operational authority. In some congregations, operational authority is held by the board itself, that the board is both the governance and the executive. If your board is making most executive decisions and almost all decisions come to the board for approval, then your board is functioning as both the governance and the executive. If some or all or the majority of your operational decision making is delegated somewhere else, let's say it's delegated to one of the styles is a subcommittee of the board, an executive team of the board made up often of the officers of the board, and that the officers of the board meet as an executive team to make operational decision making. That's one form. Another form is a separate executive team that is not made up of board members, that is accountable to the board, often named by the board, but makes the operational decision making on behalf of the board by delegation. Another structure, one of the more common ones in some of our larger congregations, is that the executive authority is delegated to the minister or delegated to an executive director, where there is an individual who can be held accountable by the board for managing those executive functions. Another structure that is often used at one or another level of complexity is a two-board structure, is where there is an operational board, often called something like a program council, that will make the operational and programming decisions, while the board focuses on the governance decisions, on strategic planning, on policy, on fiduciary oversight, on assessment. And that you end up having, in essence, two separate boards, one of them probably not called a board, that one is responsible for the operational decisions of the congregation and the other is responsible for the governance and oversight, roles of the congregation. There's probably some others. I've said when I do the in-person workshop, I say there are two others that I know of. One of them is nobody. Everybody's responsible for making operational decisions, and whoever is the person there at the moment can make the decision. Now, that's not a great plan, but it's surprising how many of our congregations function that way. And the other is usually what is referred to as the matriarch or patriarch model. It's that, or the elder model. It's that there is some long-term trusted leaders of the congregation who are the ones who make those kinds of operational decisions when the board is not making them. So this is part of my saying all of our congregations are different. And you are able to I hope you're able to discern through my talking about some of this, be able to start discerning and seeing who you are, who your congregation is, how your congregation functions. Part of my goal of this workshop is to give you enough of the theory so that you can begin discerning what your congregation's governance identity is, and be able to look at that in the lens of whether it's working for you or not. It's not a question of what is right, but a question of whether it works for your congregation. I will say this though, the more formal the executive, the more it's written into policy and procedure, then the greater the accountability. The less formal the executive, the less accountability. So in the systems where you have Carver, where there is strict limitations around the executive, then there is, in essence, the most accountability. In the whoever sees the problem is the one charged to make the decision about solving it more model, there is no accountability, or very little. Go to the next slide. So shifting from talking about the executive, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking specifically about the nature of our congregation's board's relationships with ministers. Because ministers are one of the big ways that we are different than governing boards in other types of institutions. Because our ministers, whether they are called or whether they are contract, and we'll talk about both, our ministers are outside of the bounds of how congregational executives and primary operational leaders usually function in most other institutions. There's a difference in relationship that's often based in the bylaws and in the governance system and in the nature of the ministry. We talked a little while ago about how many boards, many bylaws make congregational ministers ex officio board members. They are board members by right of office, and that makes them long-term board members. In the case of a called minister, the board member with an indefinite tenure. And they really often, over time, become some of the institutional wisdom of the board. In many cases, though not all, they're non-voting. But there are cases where ministers are voting ex officio members of their governing boards. This has the position of someone who is a staff member also serving as a board member of the congregation, which is a complicated relationship, especially when it comes to things I'm not going to talk about today, but which your primary contact can help you with, which is questions of professional development for your ministers, good ministry oversight and assessment and supervision. In some bylaws, there's a clear separation. I want to hold this up. There are also some bylaws where there's a clear separation between the board and the minister, where the minister is not a member of the board. There's actually one congregation in our region that I know of where the minister attends board meetings only at board request and invitation, because they went the other direction in defining that relationship. that the board is responsible fully for the operations, vision, and mission of the congregation, and the minister is responsible for ministering in the sense of ministering to the people of the congregation. When a board member is ex officio, they're both board member and clergy, and this can create times of conflict around pastoral care, where, especially during a board conflict, it can make for complicated relationships around the religious roles that the minister holds. And it does sometimes matter if the minister is called or contract. Now let me define those two. A called minister is called by a vote of the congregation to an indefinite tenure, and there is an understanding of a spiritual nature of that call. A contract minister is hired by the governing board to a specific tenure, and is not, the call is in essence an election by a vote of the congregation. A contract minister is not elected by a vote of the congregation. They are hired by the governing board to perform certain ministerial tasks within the congregation. And so it makes a difference. A contract minister is far more accountable to the governing board than a called minister is. Now, that doesn't mean the called minister should not be in covenantal relationship with the governing board and should not have mutual accountability, but there isn't that formal accountability that exists in contract ministry. And because of this complexity, many boards covenant with their ministers, that they form specific spiritual relationships. Covenant to me is that kind of relationship that you've invested your deepest trust in, that is in light of some larger ideal, some value, some principle. And oftentimes we will work with congregations and ministers to be able to be specific about what the commitments you're making to each other is, because of these very complicated roles that exist between ministers and governing boards. I will name, and Beth, I'll invite you to share from your perspective. I would name that probably 20% of the conflict I mediate is because of these lack of clarity, these kind of messy relationships between governing boards and their ministers.
Yeah,
these conflicting roles, right?
I would agree.
Yeah, it's around 20 to 25% of the conflict that we're invited in to help congregations find their way through. And so that's why we emphasize this. Board covenanting with the minister, even beyond just the regular covenant between board members, is a vital way to be clear about what the expectations are. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to do a quick introduction of this one, and I'm going to throw it to Beth for a little bit. So, you know, you have relationships in the congregation that already existed before you came on the board, hopefully. I don't want to assume that that's always true, but I hope that you did. And people begin to see you differently once you're on a governing board, especially when the system comes under some tension, under some stress. And I name this just to help board members be prepared for it. The first is that, you know, people see you through the lens of your congregational leadership as well as your membership. That when they're speaking to you, they're not just speaking to you as, I'm gonna use Becca's name because she's at the top of my screen and I know Becca. That they're not just seeing Becca as Becca who they've taught RE with. They're seeing Becca as someone who has some institutional authority and responsibility within the system. And so you have to keep that lens in your mind, that they're not just speaking to Becca, their friend, anymore. They're also speaking to a board member. You don't get to take that role off because they're the ones putting it on you. Some fellow congregations may have expectations of you that you are not aware of. Welcome to religious leadership in our movement, in our tradition. They might feel that you share a commitment with them that you may not know that they feel that way, but they expect something of your board service that you're not aware of. And just to be prepared for that. There's no way to stop that or be around that. That's just as a reality. And some congregants may view you through the lens of however they view the governing board. I'm gonna use an example of a congregation. Need to add some female hats to the workshop. I've got it. I hear you. There's some on this slide. But one of I have a congregation who I'm not going to speak their name, but a congregation where the board has been in significant conflict over the years within the congregation and within themselves. And board members report when they become a board member of this congregation, they report that all of a sudden people start viewing them with distrust, people that they had close relationships with. And I have to tell them, this is not about you. It's about people's relationship to the board as an institution. And that'll only change with time and you being trustworthy and you being able to hold that projection, that differentiation, and not react to it as if it's personal. Over time, it will change. But for right now, people in this particular congregation have a distrust of the governing board that extends beyond the individuals on it and has extended beyond those individuals for a long period of time. And just a matter of how structural analysis works in congregations. You will now also, as a board member, be included in some information that is appropriately confidential, that cannot be shared, sometimes legally cannot be shared, and how you hold that, and to do some work beforehand thinking about, you may know something that you can't tell other members of the congregation, and although I think this is a rare case, it doesn't happen all that often, you may know something for, I think, a short period of time that you can't tell even members of your family in different circumstances and situations in board leadership. And I name it beforehand because I want you to think about what that means and how you hold that and when it happens. I will talk a little bit in next session about the difference between confidentiality and secrecy. In short, I will say that confidentiality exists for appropriate work to be done, and secrecy is about power. And we will go deeper into what that means. But and we, your UUA regional staff, frankly, we have a more formal relationship with you now. I used to joke as district executive that I had 16,000 Unitarian Universalists in my congregation. And I couldn't have a deep, close relationship, or a closer relationship with all 16,000 of them. And my goal was to have a close relationship with the members of the governing boards that I served. And that's the leaders, the congregational leaders as a regional staff. And so I just wanted to name and recognize that. Beth, I'm gonna throw it to you for a few minutes.
One of the things I also wanted to point out with role clarity is that, and this is one I run into quite a bit, is the role of hiring someone out of your congregation as a staff person. And it's not recommended that you do that. It's often recommended that if somebody's hired out of the congregation, that they potentially be expected to give up their membership. There are congregations who have rules that they can't hire members. But it does happen when you have that quarter-time or half-time position and you live out in the middle of nowhere, you're not going to get somebody in who's going to do the job who's not a member of the congregation. So one of the things I want to talk about is that you need to really make sure there are boundaries around that job description and the relationships with those people. I can speak from experience, knowing many people who've been in this position of governing boards who've actually said, well, you're over your time, it'll just be your volunteer hours. And that's not legal, first of all, and that's not fair, because you don't dictate how anybody else volunteers their time. So I just want to be sure that if you're hiring or you have an employee who is also a member of your congregation, there has to be a very delineated and clear time when they're in their position as a staff member and when they're functioning as a congregational member. That's going to be really hard to get the rest of your congregation to understand, but it's especially important for the board to understand and to back up that staff member when they're faced with that conflict. So that was one thing I wanted to throw in there.
Thank you, Beth. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the board as a good employer. Mm-hmm. I wanted to name that role clarity is remembering that there are limits and expectations to the role you are playing in the congregational life at any particular time, and to do your best to stay within that role. When you're functioning although people project upon you and see you as a board member all the time, to try and be clear with people and saying, yes, I'm a board member, but in this moment, I need you to let me to be an RE teacher. Let me to teach RE right now. And ask people to do that. And I find that most often when you name it to them, they're willing to do that. But it's more important that you be aware of it, that you be aware of what role you're in any particular moment, so that you're functioning in that way that is appropriate. So there's in many ways, not functioning as an RE teacher while you're sitting solely as an RE teacher while you're in the boardroom. that you're looking beyond the needs of just the RE program and at the overall needs of the whole congregation. If you're functioning as a board member, be a board member, and strive to shift the lens through which you view the congregation and function within the congregation. And what we mean by that is to be able to just be aware of how you're viewing things. Because you might see different things. If you're seeing things as a lens, through the lens of the overall needs of the congregation, you might see different things than if you're just looking through the lens of a congregant who is sitting there to enjoy the worship service, to engage in the worship service and be transformed by it. Be aware when others are confused by your role and help them to help you maintain your role clarity. That's the piece that I said about, it's usually pretty good to ask people to say, hey, can I just be an RE teacher right now? I'd be happy to talk to you about that thing you're mad about with the board later. I'm teaching the class at this moment. And usually they're okay with that. And this is, I think, the most difficult part of being a board member of a congregation, is maintaining this role clarity, is keeping the lens of which role you're in at any particular moment. So next slide. So I'm going to run through this really fast, this section, because this is a half day of the strategic board workshop. But I wanted to give you just a feel for what I believe, and this is, I'm going to own this as mine. Dan Hotchkiss once told me that this is the kind of thing that he thinks I will someday write a book on. But writing a book sounds terribly boring to me. I'd rather do workshops. These are the 5 things that I think that if a congregational board is doing these 5 things, they are meeting their strategic responsibilities. So I'm just going to run through them. The first one is congregation mission and vision. This is the responsibility of the governing board to constantly be asking itself questions about who are we? What is our identity? How does our identity, how does our purpose in this as being a religious community, how does that affect the decisions that are before us? So I believe that congregational boards have to have the time and the space to do regular conversation and discernment with each other about who the congregation is, and see where you can come to some commonality and shared understanding of your congregation's purpose and what's most important, of the ways your congregation's culture affects decision making and valuation, and how you view what is of the greatest priority. And there's lots of ways to do this. One of the techniques we'll teach in session 3 is called powerful questions, where we suggest that a good 20 to 30 minutes of every board meeting be spent on a powerful open question about the nature of your congregation and its commitments in the world. But there's going to be no decision made from it, where you as a board basically are learning about each other and the congregation together to better guide your decision making in the future. We'll talk about that. But some congregations would like to do this mission and vision discernment at the congregational level, and there's appropriate place for that. I think led by the board, but there's appropriate place for that. But if we're doing it as a committee of the whole, which is what the congregational meeting actually is, then our mission vision discernment will be very slow. And I think the world changes faster than that. I think that we need the board, the congregations entrust the governing board to be able to do this discernment and to share the discernment with the congregation. In session 2, we'll talk about healthy disclosure and how you share what it is you're doing as a board. It takes deep listening to the congregation, not just in formal structures, but in informal structures. What are the legal responsibilities of a board member? That is the next one. So that's a great transition. Thank you. Conversely, what are the legal susceptibilities of a board member? What can you be sued for? I saw that one, so you didn't have to read it, Beth. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So the second of the strategic tasks that I think congregational boards have is being a good fiduciary. Now, fiduciary is a word that often attracts images of money, but fiduciary responsibility of a board is much larger than money. It involves protection and the appropriate use of all of the resources of the congregation. Those resources are financial, at least at some level, in most of our congregations. It's often never enough, but it is a financial resource. But it's also stewardship. It's helping to grow that stewardship component of our congregation's life so that we have those financial resources. That is a resource of the congregation. It's also the legal and moral accountability. And you asked the question, what are the legal responsibilities of a board member? We, in our tradition, have a spiritual and a polity commitment that the organizing body of the congregation is the congregational meeting. State law does not recognize that. State law recognizes the governing board as the as the fiduciary body, as the responsible parties. So under state law, you are, as a board member, are responsible for maintaining that the congregation is abiding by its governing documents, that it is maintaining, following all the appropriate laws, and I can't tell you what those are for your congregation because they're different in different states, especially in Maryland. Maryland has some strange laws around congregations. If I'm the primary contact for some of our Maryland congregations. If I haven't spoken to you about that, and you please call me. But different states have different laws around that. For the most part, they're not as strange as Maryland's are. There are also legal responsibilities to make sure that there's the appropriate protection of individuals, of people who are vulnerable in your congregation, that you have appropriate, and Pennsylvania has some very strict laws around protection of youth within congregations, and the board has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the congregation is following those laws for background checks and other things. So it changes, and here's the thing I say about what can you be sued for. Anybody can be sued for anything. What successful suits are is most often when a congregation is A, violates a contract that they have made with an outside entity, or B, not following their own governing documents, not following their own bylaws or things like that. It almost in many states doesn't matter what your governing documents say, except for in Maryland where there are some specific requirements, but you're not following them. That's just why governing documents are so important. I will say this, it is a fiduciary responsibility for the board, I think, to the protection of assets, to have good insurance. Yeah. And I don't do ads for Church Mutual, but I will say this, the majority of our congregations do have Church Mutual, and one of the things that Church Mutual does is they indemnify the board against personal loss and against personal responsibility. That you are, and some congregations have incorporated for the same reason. Not all congregations are required to incorporate or under state law need to. But the question of how the board protects the institution is the center of the fiduciary responsibility. And there's also I'm going to name one before I talk about finances, and that is, I believe that the congregation's reputation is a resource, and that the board has a fiduciary responsibility for the protection and appropriate use of the congregation's reputation. Some people say we shouldn't do that social justice cause because it'll affect our reputation, and I think the board has a responsibility on both ends, both for the protection of the reputation of the congregation and for its appropriate use to leverage achieving your mission and vision in the world. And so what the answer to that is depends upon the circumstance and depends upon what the issue is. And that's why the board should do good discernment about your mission vision, is so that you can make appropriate discernment about whether it is fiduciarily good use of different aspects of the congregation to meet that mission and vision. I also think that, the people of the congregation are a resource, that the board has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that people are being able to rest, and that their gifts are being used to the best to the best use of the congregation, of meeting the congregation's goals. And if we go to the next slide. The board has a responsibility for the financial protection of the congregation. And that doesn't mean just stewardship, that also means good financial practices, that means good oversight, that means making sure that there are the appropriate protections around money and staffing to be able to say that the resources are being protected and well used. I'm gonna say that you should, if you have questions around your fiduciary responsibility, this is a great conversation to have with your primary contacts. Your UUA staff primary contacts have gone pretty deep in helping boards to understand their fiduciary responsibilities and roles. And we have a whole nother set of resources within the UUA, including the Church Staff Finance Office, who can help congregations think through particular staffing issues and financial issues. So reach out to your primary contacts with questions related to your congregation's fiduciary responsibility. Next slide. I'm going to do this one really fast because we're going to do it in depth in a few minutes, and I'm taking longer at this than I expected, which is something I'm learning. Remember, we're learning this experience. And that is, I believe the board has the responsibility for the promulgation of all policy in the congregation. Policy is what we do. And we're just gonna move on from this one because I have a whole set of slides on this. So just know that the board has a fiduciary responsibility for that. Strategic planning, short version of this is the board is the entity that should be looking down the road towards what is the future of the congregation and setting a roadmap to be able to get there. We taught for a long time what we call 5-year plans, which is where boards do a major effort and congregations do a major effort to come up with a 5-year plan, and lots of congregational input and making it a great big task force and exploration within the congregation. And then the most common reaction, the most common result of those 5-year plans was that they went up on a shelf, and 4 years later somebody took them down and looked at them to determine what they should have done that they didn't do. I actually am teaching a new model, and that is what I call a 3-year rolling plan. This comes from some of our nonprofit partners, where each year the board takes a look at the year of the strategic plan that has just been completed to see how well it was done, adds a little more detail to the next 2 years, and puts on a skeleton of the 3rd year. But however you do it, whatever the structure, and whether you do it yourself or whether you delegate it to a task force, it is the board's responsibility to make sure that the congregation has a plan to achieve its mission and goals. And and however that is done, it just to name the responsibility. Next slide. And the last is assessment. It's hard to know where you want to go if you don't know where you are, if you don't have an understanding of what has occurred within the congregation. And one of the things I think, and this is a critique I have of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and this is being recorded and I could get in trouble for this, but is that we have a bad habit of creating programs and running them for a few years, and then the program goes away and we create a new program, rather than taking the time to assess and look at how that program, what it accomplished, what its successes were, what its challenges were, and really learning from that. I think boards should be able to work into their board year, some specific time every year, to take 1 or 2 areas of congregational life that you're going to take a deeper look at. And the board gets to choose this. It may be, and when I teach this, I teach that board should probably look at 1 operational administrative area each year and 1 program area each year. That you just say, we're going to ask some deeper questions and go talk to the committees that are responsible. And let's say this year our 2 areas are youth programming and the building, how we're maintaining the building. And the board just does some research to find out where you are and what's happening in those areas, and maybe make some policy decisions out of that. Maybe give some advice to some committees, like ask the building committee to do the research on a 20-year building maintenance plan, projecting out 20 years the life of different aspects of your building so that you can plan for it budget-wise, when your roof is going to break down, when your water heater is likely to die when it reaches the end of its lifespan. Those are the kinds of things, and in youth ministry, to do some assessment with the teachers, to have a board subcommittee talk to the youth ministry advisors to figure out how well the program is engaging our youth, to look at some data about what happens with youth when they leave your congregation. Are they leaving with connections to the congregation, or if they're leaving town, are they going off to college and building in connections to a Unitarian Universalist congregation where they are going? It's whatever it is you're studying. The point is that I think the board has an assessment responsibility to be able to gather data, either yourself or in a task force that you have created and delegated to, about what is happening within your congregation's administration, operations, and programming. Next slide. So on top of all that, I think operational boards also have to run the church. right? Have the responsibilities. This is getting scary, right? All these things that are responsibilities. And I'm just saying that not every board is going to be able to do all these all the time, or at least not at the beginning. But this is kind of the ideal of the responsibilities I think the governing boards hold. They also sometimes have to manage either the relationships with committees, and boards often, especially the liaison and portfolio boards, end up doing a lot of mediation between committees as a significant part of their work. Mediation between the competition for resources or space or anything like that. But also, you know, my favorite mediation I ever did was between the aesthetics committee and the worship committee of a congregation over a plan to paint the sanctuary pink. That was just so much fun. You know, it's just a moment. But it was like Pepto-Bismol pink too. I mean, it was there. So just to say, I say in there, wouldn't you rather be a strategic board, as the ad for coming to the strategic board workshop when it is near you. So second to last thing we're going to do, I think, is we're going to talk about governance documents for a few minutes. And congregations have a lot of governance documents. I want to give you a quick way of an encapsulated way to understand your governance documents for your congregation in 4 specific bowls. And you see there's this picture of wonderful nesting bowls up on the screen. Those bowls, mixing bowls that sit within each other. I like this metaphor, and this metaphor comes from Dan Hotchkiss in Governance and Ministry, because it's a way to understand the way all of our congregation's governing documents hang together. The green bowl, the outer bowl there, is the outer structure. It is the bylaws. It is the outer structure that creates the bowl that holds everything else within it. It's the widest. It's also the hardest to change, the hardest to adapt. It designs the relationship between the board and the congregation, and can only be altered by a vote of the congregation. Even though the board often recommends changes to the bylaws, it is only the congregation that can vote to change them. And in some of our congregations, it can take 2 votes to change the bylaws. 2 votes in 2 separate congregational meetings. And it defines the parts of the congregation that are directly accountable to the congregation through the congregational meeting. And so the discernment about what should be in your bylaws is, what does the congregational meeting want to have directly accountable to the congregational meeting? And oftentimes there's a different level of discernment that some congregations will put into bylaws. And that is, I'm not agreeing with this, I'm just saying that it's true. What don't we want the board to have the authority to change themselves? Right? So those are the 2 motivations why most things go in the bylaws. Now, I'm a purist in some ways, in that I believe that the simpler the bylaws are, the better, the more adaptable the congregation is. That something that's in the bylaws is the hardest to change. But I also own that there are times where congregations want to put limitations upon a board's ability to change the structure. And so just acknowledge that's a reason why that happens. The next bowl the yellow bowl that was there, the one is what I call governing policies. And governing policies, and Dan Hotchkiss talks about this, is where governing policies are where the congregation structure goes that is not in the bylaws. I think governing policies is where your committee charges, the charges that say what a committee is, how it's formed, how it's held accountable, how its membership changes over, that's defined in your governing policies, and that the board can change that by a vote of policy. The board promulgates policy, so either drafts it or delegates drafting and then approves the policy themselves. It can also it defines the rest of the congregation's accountability with the governing board, where bylaws define the board's accountability with the congregation. Governing policies define the rest of the congregation structure's accountability with the governing board. Now, I say this to say, not all congregational boards are the ultimately accountable entity in the congregation. There are some of our congregations where large elements of the congregation structure are directly accountable to the congregational meeting, not to the governing board. So there is a lot of variety and diversity in how our congregations are organized, and I name these things for you to be able to look at your own system and to be able to determine what is true for your congregation. The next slide has the blue bowl, which is our operational policies. And operational policies are what most people think of when they think of policy. Operational policies are what we do, right? All the things we do. You have an operational policy on how to rent the building out to someone else. I hope your congregations have an operational policy on how you manage a disruptive person in the congregation. I hope your congregations have an operational policy around safety and safe congregations. All the things that define what we do, not how we're structured, but what we do, are your operational policies. My favorite operational policy I've ever had the privilege to work on was one that for the inclusion of service animals in our congregation, because state law required that service animals be included in all aspects of the congregation's life for people who needed them. And we had many service animals in the congregation I served, but we also had a lot of people with animal allergies. And so how to work through that challenge, which involved some research into the building's air conditioning system and HEPA filters. It involved figuring out how the airflow went in the sanctuary and defining one part of the sanctuary for service animals to be in that was closest to the air return, so that we could make space, a welcoming space for all of the people in our congregation. It also involved some pastoral work of going in and helping the person who now needed to move to the other side of the sanctuary and would no longer be sitting in the place that her family had sat in for 20 years. To be able to manage those pieces. So it's about more than putting the documents on paper, because congregations are not made up of documents, they're made up of people. And I say that just to say that as boards are doing policy work, realize you're doing policy work around people and their relationships, and to take that into account. The last one I'll do really fast is procedures, and procedures are how you do it. I don't think boards should be aware of procedures, but it's not your responsibility. Procedures should be drafted by the people responsible for doing things. The kitchen team should make the procedure, whether it's formally written or informally just understood, the kitchen procedure for how to make coffee on Sunday morning. Your staff members should have their own procedures, and they should have the authority to determine how they do things. Now, why do we write procedures down? Because that's how we capture institutional wisdom. Because you had a volunteer organization, most people don't have a lot of when you change over leadership as much as we like to, you need to find ways to capture that institutional wisdom about how we do things. So next slide. And now I hand it off to Beth.
Real quick though, we do have a question in the chat. Question for later. Called ministers are not as accountable to the board as contract ministers. What is the best way to manage or accommodate this? Policy, negotiation, arbitration, other?
Real fast. First off, covenant between the congregational board and the minister. 2, some clear lines of accountability that are built into the letter of call. That when you do call a minister, you do that in your letter of agreement or a letter of call or a ministerial contract, and you build those clear lines in there. 3rd, I point everybody towards a wonderful resource created by the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association called Fulfilling the Call, which provides some good practices and standards and a tool for ministry for the evaluation of all the ministries of a congregation, and for some good communications tools for how to be in that conversation. And lastly, for deeper understanding on that, I encourage you to reach out to your primary contact, because trust me, this question is one we do a lot, right?
Yes. All right, I'm going to talk about board as good employer. There's some key things you should know as an employer. Every congregation should have both an employee handbook and a volunteer handbook. Your employee handbook determines basic policies around your treatment of employees. It outlines your grievance procedure. It has basic things like vacation time and time off, and what's the procedure for asking for time off, and how often evaluation and supervision will be done. Volunteer handbooks spell out the expectation of your volunteers. What's the firing process for volunteers? And yes, there have been times when we've had to fire volunteers from their positions. Maybe even job descriptions, a description of procedures. If you have certain things that a particular, the greeter should have, the greeter checklist, for example. What does the hospitality committee? This might also be a place where some of the other documents, like when we're making coffee, where can we find that? It would be in this document. The Ohio-Meadville District had a volunteer handbook that required every committee chair and committee member sign a document saying they'd read it every year, because we felt it was that important. Every employee should have an up-to-date job description. This forms a basis for evaluation and supervision. If you don't have an up-to-date job description, you have nothing with to evaluate. If the job description is based on when you use paper and pencil to track things and now you're using a computer database, the skills needed and the processes used are not the same. So there's no benchmark. They should be reviewed annually for updates and changes, and if you're using them as a comparison for evaluation and supervision, then you're going to notice when something needs updated and changed. It also should be something you look at and say, can this realistically be accomplished in the hours the person's being asked to work? If half your items say, if time permits in front of them, you need to cut down what's on your job description. Maybe one item should say that, definitely not more than two. And professional development should be part of your job description and should be considered part of the person's official work time. Professional development should not be expected to be done when they're on their own personal time. We have a tendency to work this into ministers and even religious educators' work. It sometimes gets short shrift with music directors, and administrators tend to get dropped altogether. But you're asking them to learn new computer programs, you're asking them to learn new systems. They should be allowed opportunities to take classes or read books or purchase whatever to get up to speed with what they need. Employees should be supervised by an individual, not a committee. This avoids conflict amongst the committee and confusion. If you have two committee members who cannot agree what the main focus of the employee is supposed to be, they're going to get into an argument, and the staff person is going to have no idea who they're supposed to be following. And it also allows for clear lines of accountability. If your DRE needs to be supervised by the RE committee, the chair should be the designated person. The personnel committee chair should be the designated person. So those are the things you might want to look at. And someone asked, do I have a link to the Ohio Volunteer Handbook? Actually, shoot me an email. I can send you the hard copy I have. The electronic copy I have. The OMD website is no longer, that was phased out when we went regional. All of the district websites no longer function. Couple other things. Evaluation should happen yearly. It allows an opportunity to set yearly goals and update the job description, give the person information if there's things they're not doing properly that they need to bring their skill level up on. They get advance notice. You can set out a plan of remediation. There's a tendency in congregations to have a punitive attitude towards evaluations. We'll evaluate when we think there's a problem. So when the word evaluation is said in a congregation to a staff member, they think they're going to lose their job, because that's usually the point where you've gotten to. And that shouldn't be the case. If evaluations are done yearly and there's always a process through them, that should not be the case. Your employees should be fairly compensated. The UUA does provide guidelines for fair compensations for most typical positions and includes benefits in that. Benefits are expected to be provided for anyone at least half-time. And I'll be perfectly honest, this is a justice issue. As congregations, we're very good at saying minimum wage should be $15 an hour, people should have health care, and then not do it in our own business. So we need to pay attention to that. State laws do vary, and I suggest you get advice about employment in your state. There are certain programs you can or cannot participate in because you are a congregation. Most states, but not all, prohibit or restrict participation in unemployment programs. This is because of separation of church and state. Some states will not allow you to participate in it at all. Some states will not allow you to pay into it in advance, but instead will ask you to reimburse them if your staff member files a claim. So you need to keep that in mind when you're thinking about your employee handbook and what your severance pay policies are going to be. If your employees cannot access unemployment, our severance pay policies should be fairly generous, especially if we're letting someone go, we're eliminating a position, a layoff of that sort. So you need to pay attention to that. Workers' compensation, on the other hand, is almost always required. So you don't have to pay unemployment, you got to pay workers' comp. Also, the employment of ministers has special rules. Federal laws govern minister employment. They're considered self-employed, they get housing allowances, and I can speak from personal experience that not all payroll services understand these rules. So before you contract with a payroll service, please make sure they know how to handle ministers as a special exception.
So, so thank you, Beth. I think you have resources there for you all. And I think we have another resource slide. Remember, we're going to send these out.
Yes.
I'm aware that we're at time and that there hasn't been space made for questions, and that's Beth and my adapting that, you know, our eyes are always too big the first time we run a website. I wanted to hold that there's probably a minute for any questions, and I will stay on the webinar afterwards until everyone else has left. So if there are any questions that come on post this time. I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight and for being present, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks. I hope this has been, I know it's been a lot of me talking at you. Our future workshops are going to be more skills-based than they are theory-based, and so I want to thank you all, and eyes are big, how is the appetite? I think that's great. So thank you all for coming tonight, and once again, if anyone has any specific questions, I will stay around. I'll be the last one to leave this Zoom room. Thank you all for coming.